Now we are downstairs and we're going to be photographing this really cool, really reflective, really interesting, really custom, really high-end bar area. Now, your first instinct may be to come in here and just plop the camera down, get a shot of everything, but we're gonna make this a little bit more interesting, and this shot is going to have a bit of nuance that does not appear in most other types of architectural photography. Now, the bar has some really incredible built-in lighting over there, but as you can see from me, there is just sort of this awful daylight coming in. And not that all daylight is awful, but in this situation, it's not gonna photograph well. It's going to flatten everything out, and it's gonna neutralize that nice, warm orange lighting. Now, before I get into lighting the scene, I wanna talk about composition. I do think this is gonna be a relatively straightforward one-point perspective. However, I have my 24mm lens on, and while that might be the first shot that jumps to mind, I see this all the time with photographers, it's actually going to be a significantly tighter and more interesting shot if we trim away the fat on this shot and get right down to business. All I want to show is the good stuff. Yes, there are plenty of walls, there are some bar stools, but that doesn't really matter here. What's cool is that amazing, amazing mirrored backsplash finish behind the bar. So as you can see, here's what it looks like at 24mm. And I mean, yeah, it's cool, but you still can't really tell what's going on. It doesn't have that high-end polished look that I'm going for with all my shots. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna try a 35mm and a 50mm composition and see what looks better. We have the space to back up, so let's see how it looks. So I've put the 1.4 extender on top of my 24mm tilt shift. So this is what it looks like at 35mm, and I think this looks great. But there's two things that I think are worth mentioning here. One, I'm already at 35mm. I feel like 50 is gonna be a little bit too tight, so what I'm gonna end up doing is just cropping. Now, I could also move the camera forward, but here's what happens. There's gonna be a lot more reflections that show up because I'm changing the perspective. I'm changing where the camera is, and that's gonna show up in those angled mirrors behind the bar. It's gonna have light going everywhere, and it's gonna be way more work for me in post. So here's a shot of what that looks like. So I've moved the camera closer to tighten things up, and as you can see, we have a lot more reflections to deal with, especially on that right-hand side and that far left-hand side, where the white paint of the walls begins to show up in the reflection. I don't want to have to either clone that out or block that. That's just a ton of surface area to cover. So I think the correct course of action here is to back up, put the camera where I had it, and just crop in a little bit. We're not losing too much of the frame with this crop. So I've got the camera where I want it. Because this is a perfect one-point perspective right in the middle of that bar, I need to take some extra time and make sure everything is styled perfectly. I want this photo to be perfectly balanced, so everything from the chairs in the foreground to all of the glasses in the background need to be arranged perfectly. I don't want anything to feel imbalanced. Now, the shot has been styled and we're ready to make our photograph. This house comes with convenient built-in blinds to block all of the light behind the camera. All you need to do for this trick to work is photograph a $30 million home and push this button. And now that the lighting in here is basically perfect, let's go ahead and finish this shot. Now, if every subject you're photographing doesn't come with conveniently built-in electronic roller blinds, the next best thing is going to be a big piece of black cloth. We're going to use that to block some of the reflections that you can see in those triangular backsplash. Is it a backsplash? I'm not sure. In that really cool triangular mirrored woodwork behind the bar. What you can see there is a few pieces of landscaping being picked up off to either side. So we're going to take a big piece of black cloth and go find exactly where those reflections are coming from, block them, and then mask them in Photoshop to make this thing look perfect. Okay, so here is my black cloth contraption. As you know, I have tried to slim down my gear kit as much as possible. So what we've got here is my little travel tripod, again with the legs spread out, and you can move this up and down to get as much coverage as you need. But this is acting as kind of a bootleg frame for this black cloth. Again, minimal gear, and that thing comes in so handy. We use it all over the world, and I don't have to schlep an aluminum frame, more light stands, A-clamps, etc. It's actually a really brilliant creative solution to getting rid of shadows and reflections. So all we're going to do is have my assistant and her little feet down there. We're going to use live view, and we're going to go find exactly where these reflections are coming from. So I'll show you that in live view as we work through it. Hold that all the way up to the ceiling, but don't touch the ceiling. Keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. Is that as high as you can go?
I'm touching the ceiling, actually.
Okay. So there's that reflection on the left. I'm going to go ahead and capture this. Okay, now we got to get this. That must be the stairs. So I'll live view this again. It's that right there. Hold it up. Okay, rotate it. You see what I'm saying? See what I'm seeing? Yeah, right there, okay. Go nice and high with that. Perfect. And then there's one more, which is that way. Yeah, so you're gonna hold that up nice and high right there. And perfect, capture. Awesome, and now the last one is a reflection on the bar, this part of the bar right here. So let's put the camera, or the flag, yeah, you're gonna come back a little bit, stand like right there. Take a step left, lower it a little bit. And that's perfect. So we've got all of our reflections taken out. All that's left to do is add a little bit of light to complete this picture. I'm really psyched with how it's gonna look. So what I'm gonna do is leave the camera right here. I'm gonna mount a B10, and all I'm going to do is take that and just add a little bit of light on the back of those chairs in the front of this bar to get a little more texture, a little bit more sex appeal to this really cool photo. Gorgeous, and now I'm going to get the right-hand side and go for it. I love it, okay. Okay, so we added a little bit of hot light using the B10. Not only did it give us some nice pools of light around those chairs and give us some texture on there, it also neutralized any of that remaining blue cast from the exterior light, a little bit of which is still trickling in through these blinds. So that being said, that completes the entire shot. Let's take this into post-production and put it together. All right guys, so here we are in post-production, and as you saw on location, we've got 10 frames to work with. We have our 5 bracketed images, a handful of light painted shots, and our 2 shots where we use the black flag to remove those reflections from the image. So let's go ahead and talk about our pictures here. So what we have are, first up, these 2 images where the black flag was used to remove that reflection behind, and I can switch between these 2 and you can see exactly what I'm talking about. Next up, we have the light painted frames where we added a bit of texture and color to the back of those chairs. And then we have our bracketed exposures, and these are definitely a little bit on the dark side. Excuse the bad Star Wars pun. They're a little darker than I think I would like. And the brightest frame is maybe a touch too far, but that's why we bracket. We do have a lot of options to choose from. And I just love the sort of moodiness of this 4th bracketed frame here. So this is what we're going to work with. It's a little bit dark on my screen right now, but the histogram has plenty of data in it, and I'm going to use my Lightroom adjustments to bring up the shadows, kind of tame the highlights, and make sure everything looks good before we finish this image off in Photoshop. So let's go ahead and get started. And as I mentioned, the shadows are a little bit too dark, so the first thing I'm going to do here is bring up those shadows. And I don't want to go too far and sort of kill the depth of this image. Something that we mentioned on location was how sexy of a space this was, right? So I just want to bring the shadows up a little bit to get some texture on that beautiful wood behind the bar. The highlights, you know, it's a little bit bright up top here. So I'm just going to bring the highlights down just a smidge. Texture clarity, dehaze. I know I'm going to be doing some compositing in Photoshop, so I'll bring, once everything is saved in that layered document, I'll bring it back into Lightroom and do that all together. Something that I noticed when we were on location and I made sure I wanted to fix in post-production was, even though we had those electronic roller blinds behind us, there was still a bit of blue light coming through. And you can see the back of these chairs is almost like a blue-green. So I'm going to go ahead and use the HSL panel here in Lightroom to sort of tame some of that blue cast. And as soon as I hover over it, again, I'm clicking the little handle here and hovering over the chair back, I can immediately take out some of those blues. I don't want to go all the way. And a bit of green as well, it looks like over here. So I'm going to grab some of those greens and pull those down. And I'll toggle this on and off. And you can definitely see how it's pulling out some of the greens and blues, even in the reflection in the mirror back there. So there was a substantial amount of color pollution coming from behind us. So this is our 4th bracket here. Like I said, this is one we're going to use. I'm going to make sure that this matches tonality wise and exposure wise the light painted and black flagged images. And I'm looking at this, I might bump this a little bit, a little brighter, like maybe a third of a stop. And if I go, yeah, that feels pretty good. I haven't completely squashed the depth of the lighting, but it's bright enough to see what's going on. And let's see, I believe that these frames, yeah, these were a stop brighter. So I'm gonna subtract, I'm gonna go ahead and make sure that all of these are, let's see, I think I wanna go minus 2/3 of a stop on these images. So I'll just sync those so that they are a third of a stop darker. And I'm gonna go ahead and add those shadow and highlight adjustments here. Being sure to uncheck, because I already adjusted the exposure to match. I just want to apply the shadow, highlight, and color adjustments. And now you can see that as I switch between these 6 images, the light painted, flagged, and original bracketed exposure, all of the exposures have been adjusted to match perfectly in Lightroom. So we are ready to go ahead and edit this in Photoshop. I'm gonna go ahead, edit, open as layers in Photoshop, and let's get those up and queued off and ready to go. Okay, so here we are in Photoshop, and I'm gonna go ahead and rename our layers so that everything is easily followable here. I'm gonna go ahead and call this left flag, and then we'll call this the right flag. And then we've got our 3 light painted frames. So right, left, and center. And I'm just going to go ahead and group these, keep things easy to follow. Light painting and flagging. So the way I'm going to do these reflection removals is very similar to how I've been working with layers throughout the tutorial. I'm going to go ahead and turn all of them off except for the right hand side here. And as you've seen me do, I'm going to Option click, add a black layer mask, take my brush, and I'm just going to go ahead and gently paint in that black flag layer. And as you can see, because we adjusted the exposure in Photoshop, nothing should really change. Everything ought to look and match up just perfectly. And you can see there's a lot of reflections being tamed. I can turn that off and on. It's actually a bit more than just what we saw on location. There was a lot of blue in those glasses being sucked out. So this was definitely a good move. Definitely a good move. On the left-hand side, I'm going to do the same thing. I'll go ahead and add a black layer mask, take my brush, and start painting in. And again, you can see what a big difference that makes behind the bar. So once that's done, we can go ahead and begin adding our light painting. I'm going to start with the right-hand side. Alt Option, I'm on a Mac, so Option click, add layer mask. That's going to fill it with black. Take my brush, make sure my foreground color is set to white. And I'm going to start gently painting in some of that light painting on the backs of those chairs. I don't really want to go too far. I don't think we need it down here. I want to keep the viewer's eye, again, moving through the frame. Go over to the left side. And the same process. Add some of that painted light in. Sort of feather it around to taste. And I wonder if I'm going to change the blend mode to lighten. Because all I'm doing is adding that light. I don't need the darker areas. And I'm going to clean that up a little bit so it doesn't bleed over onto the bar. I'm going to do the same thing on the right hand side. And lastly, in the center, change the blend mode to lighten, add a black layer mask, grab a brush, Let's see. And I'm just going to go ahead and even out the back of that chair. All right, that's looking pretty good. As I remove these reflections and clean up this image, I begin to see a few things that are a little bit distracting. So I'm gonna go ahead and fix those. The first thing I see that's kind of bugging me is this reflection here in the black. So I'm going to add a curves adjustment layer. I'll collapse our groups here. Add a curves adjustment layer. And I'm gonna make that significantly darker because I wanna darken that reflection again on the black face of that bar, the black front of it here. And I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna invert this mask and fill it with black. And then I'm gonna grab a brush and I'm just gonna start painting this with a soft brush to be a little darker so that is not so distracting. And once I have a rough sort of mask here, I'm going to darken that a little more, see if I can't get that to match even better. And I'm going to switch my foreground colors here, grab a smaller brush, and just carefully go around that edge. And make that reflection not as distracting. I don't need to remove it entirely. I just want to tame it significantly. And there's a bit of blue in there, so in this curves adjustment, I'm going to grab the blues, pull them down. Now I got a little green and some red. Might just need to be desaturated overall. There's a little bit of blue in here. And it's just some very subtle shifts. There's like a fingerprint on here or something. I'm not sure what that is. I'm gonna grab a brush and at 30% opacity, just sort of make this transition a little more seamless. There we go. That's looking pretty good. Not a huge move, but if I turn it on and off, you can really see how distracting that was. And there's a little nub down here with that mask, so I'm gonna brush that out. There we go. Okay, and let's see, that's looking substantially better, I think. As with a lot of my images, do I wanna get rid of this? Yeah, I'm gonna see if I can just, again, sort of paint away some of this reflection here. I'm, again, painting on that same mask that I used up here. Just sort of darkening these reflections in the lower glass face of that bar, zooming out so I can sort of get a helicopter view of this whole thing and see how my work fits in. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. And as I remove reflections, I see some of these distracting things up here, so I'm going to clone out some of the like speakers and sprinklers up here that are a little bit of a nuisance. And then after that, I think we will be all set. So I'm gonna grab the clone tool and just gently sort of pull out some of these, like I said, the sprinklers and the warts and stuff that show up. I think I can get rid of these lights as well here. Let's see if I can just content aware these. Get rid of them. You know what might be a little bit quicker is if I just content aware some of these. So I'm going to flatten everything to a new layer. And let's see if I can just zap these real quick. Okay, so it looks like our work in Photoshop is done. I'm going to go ahead and save this back into Lightroom and make our final adjustments over there. Okay, so here we are back in Lightroom with our almost finished image. I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of contrast to the scene, a little bit of texture and clarity. I think our vibrance and saturation is about where it needs to be. We don't need to go too far, again, because this image was super sexy as it was almost straight out of camera. Just very subtle adjustments here for some contrast. Maybe the shadows need a little tiny bump. And I'm gonna go ahead and let's make sure that our verticals are nice and straight. So I'm gonna do a guided transform here. And go ahead and line everything up here in Lightroom. Make sure everything is nice and straight. Our vertical lines are looking great. Go ahead and commit that. And I'm just going to do a little crop. Sort of tighten this up and get rid of some of the edges. So there is our final image, guys. Pretty simple. Adding those flags to remove some of those reflections in the back, adding a little bit of light painting to add a little bit of zing to this picture. Looking really good. And you know what? We had some great light to work with. We just had to tweak it and sort of massage it to get an amazing photo. So let's go back on location, knock out a few more in this basement in this amazing home.